Hello, hello. We're going to get started now. All right. We're going to have a nice conversation. So if I may, Matt, if you don't mind joining us in the circle.
Yeah, front.
Love to hear from you. Okay, welcome everyone. This is our session 2. Some of you all were here for the last one, for those who are not. And if we haven't met, I'm Ander, I'm a product manager on the Flutter team, but today is more about the discussion among the group, not, even though it's my face up there, I ideally won't say anything. And Dobo is going to be the main moderator today, and the topic of this discussion is past, present, future of native interop. So with that, Dobo, take it away.
Thank you. Yes, so this doc says 3-minute introduction on native interop, which I was not prepared for, but I am prepared for. So let's see. The current interop story is Dart and Flutter run on a bunch of different operating systems, and we are trying to make nice interop for all of them. So we have a thing called Dart FFI, which allows you to call C code from Dart. On top of Dart FFI, we have FFI gen, because you don't want to write bindings by hand. It takes in header files from C and generates bindings. If you're on macOS or targeting iOS, FFI gen can also generate bindings for Objective-C. There it's a bit more convoluted, because sometimes if you do callbacks, for example, it also needs to generate some Objective-C bridging code, which then forces your package to be a Flutter plugin, because you need to bundle that code somehow. On the Android side, we have package J and iGen, which takes in Java header files or doc files, if I'm not, like Java docs, if I'm not mistaken, and generates bindings for Java and Kotlin. And then that also causes your work to be a Flutter plugin, because there's some bridging code which needs to be included. And then the final part of the interoperability story that we're currently working on is a way to bundle native code without things being a Flutter plugin, which is the work on build hooks and link hooks, which will enable building and bundling native code in different languages in Dart packages in standalone. I'm not sure if that was 3 minutes, but that's like the breadth of the work we're working on. I haven't plugged in my laptop, but at some point I had this XKCD image where it's you have this one tiny package, which is the Linux ecosystem thing, and the whole tower is built on top of it. And that's, sometimes that's how we talk about, FFI, somewhere down there's always some FFI. Yeah, so that's what we're working on. You can ask me a bunch of questions. Is there anyone that just has a question right out of the bat, out of interop, before we jump into some preceded questions?
Maybe. Oh, I guess. Since we just had the previous session with the Swift package manager, and I don't know, probably a bunch of you write Swift packages, and of course this week some eager developer updated to Xcode 16, and I get a bug report, now it doesn't compile anymore. Would .ffi have helped me here if I were on that already?
As opposed to what?
To my manual Swift implementation of my...
Writing Dart using the FFI stuff to actually back.
Yeah. Or would I have now two problems that, so what I think is going on, I wasn't able to debug it while I'm here. Now I have to add some annotations for the new Swift 6 stuff or something to my Swift class, right? Communicating with the Apple platform. And now I wonder if I have been using .ffi with code generation on that site, would I be blocked now because the customer says, oh, I can't compile the package with Xcode 16 anymore. And I said, yeah, but I can't do anything about it because there's some generated code inside, and that would need to be updated. So please wait for the next Flutter version to work with the next Xcode version, maybe? Or would you say, no, I don't have that problem at all. We have customers that are already on Xcode 16, and all our packages, which we've built with this approach, work just fine. That would be my...
I understand. It needs to be built with what,
Basically, you're asking, when you ship a package, how do you ensure that the people that are building for their apps are on the right versions.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that
So
seems to be the current problem.
part of the stuff that I know y'all are working on is making sure that whatever you're building for the host is going to decide with your stuff, making sure that you're compiling and shipping your app with the right versions, because you're binding against the current Objective-C headers or the current things. And so FFI will help with that, because you have the C source file, and you can compile for whatever architectures are needed at that time, at the build process time. So instead of ahead of time with pre-building. Is that close?
Kind of, it's basically, okay, can I support multiple Xcode versions, for example, or multiple, then it's macOS versions, right? Because they have different headers and sometimes. Yeah, so for example, in our case, the headers changed and they have like a new enum case now, right? And so I have to support multiple macOS versions where the consumer might be compiling their app.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of components here. One of them is like the actual like compilation and binding, and that's where these hooks, they are run like by your users and not by you, right? Like, so on their machine. So because like the compilation in that sense is quote unquote delayed, that would help there. But of course that doesn't help yet with like versions queue. If there's like if you have like a new case in enum. One of the things that we've been looking at least for the macOS and iOS APIs, is this. It's like some kind of like annotations for like which API is available in which OS version. And there's like a bunch of different questions there that can be solved. So one of them is like, if you run the like, let's say it's Objective-C, like then you can run FFI-Gen. Swift we don't currently bind yet. We have a project going on called Swift-Gen, which will generate, Swift code with Objective-C compatibility annotation so that you can call it from the FFI. But for those, there's a question about like, if there's APIs and they're evolved in like a compatible way, then you can generate your bindings. But of course you need to regenerate them when a new API comes out, right? Because otherwise your bindings aren't there. You need to like rerun FFI-Gen. Now hopefully, this is like a almost zero effort, right? You get the newest version of Xcode to get the new bindings. You run the tool, and then you probably bump the major version of your package, and you republish the package. Now, of course, if someone has an older version of Xcode or an older version of the OS, some of those APIs might not be available, right? So kind of a step on top of that is like, how do we deal with that? So there's like. One of the things that we've been looking at is specifying like a version range which we are interested in, so that like anything, for example, some APIs by Apple have been like deprecated 10 years ago and you shouldn't use them anymore, so we should just stop generating them because you should not be using them. So that's like on the code generation level, but then another thing is like at the runtime level, maybe you want to actually branch on like, okay, if this API is not available because I'm like on an older version of the OS, maybe I want to have some like fallback behavior, or I want to give some proper error message. So there's like a bunch of layers here in the versioning. Compared to what you're describing now, I think they should be easier to manage with FFI-Gen, because you still as a package author need to go and generate the latest versions and republish, because we don't run FFI-Gen for every user on their machine against their version of Xcode, because that would be slow and everyone would need to have Clang installed, etc. So that's still a manual step, and there's some delay there, but hopefully that becomes much less work than manually coding up stuff. And then the other stuff for managing the versions, we have open issues and some design plans, but we don't actually have a solution there yet. So the only solution that's in currently is like not generating code for stuff that's been deprecated for 10 years. But like the runtime branching on which version is available, that currently doesn't exist yet.
Let me ask you something. for FFI Gen, I mean, when it relates to Objective-C, does that allow you to pull in dependencies from places like CocoaPods or just adding frameworks directly? I've had issues in the past when trying to integrate like Objective-C or C++ code into iOS, and then using a plugin and getting that working because my pod has to fetch it from like has to fetch OpenCV from another source, or has to embed it within the library that uses it. So it's like, I'm just wondering whether or not that will simplify the process by taking a lot of layers out of the complexity in terms of like a dependency that uses something that's like tied to like Objective-C++ and whatnot, or C++.
Yes and no. So yes, because you will not have to deal with, I don't know, your CocoaPod spec and things not working there. No, because somewhere you still need to specify where those dependencies come from, and you need to bundle them. So the work that we've been doing with the build hooks and being able to include dynamic libraries in a project with build hooks, that creates like a unified way that, in my opinion, is easier to understand than CocoaPod's build files to bundle dynamic libraries. But if you have some code that pulls in a bunch of other dependencies, you will still need to like somehow run somewhere that logic that pulls in all these dependencies and makes like all these dynamic libraries in one directory and report them in the build hook.
So it doesn't work on transitives, is that what you're saying? So
no, I've like brainstormed a bit about like what do we do with transitive dependencies and with package managers and reproducibility, because you're going to hook up to the internet there, but we don't have like a clear-cut solution there yet.
So the best you could do is like just like if I have an iOS or Objective-C framework, that I would be able to reference it as an asset and it'll be able to load it at runtime. Is that what or at compile time?
There's a couple of different options here. So the way that like the build hooks work is they're invoked when you do Flutter build or Flutter run,
Right.
And it's free form what you can do there. So one of the things that I would hope that the community would take up is like this freeform thing that is like a Dart script that you can write to have some helper packages that do some of the things that are very common to do. And I think it would be a common thing to do that you have like your own framework and it has a bunch of dependencies, and there's probably like some Xcode build command line commands that you can run in order to have that like packaged exactly in the way that you can report it as an asset, and that could be like a helper package that the community could build.
Right. All right. I guess it's a bit more complex because I remember, when I first had to integrate that as a plugin, that was some of the pain points I had to deal with, just getting OpenCV to work, which works fine on Android, but on iOS it was it's a bit of a challenge. But thankfully we had a pod that worked, so that kind of helped. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. For example, if you say like there's a pod that works.
Well, it was an internal pod that we use that reference OpenCV. So in order to get our internal dependency to work, we had to like find a way to just pull in like OpenCV. But that was separate from the issue. It's just like it probably would have been easier if OpenCV didn't have to be embedded into a framework to get the latest version. And that's more of a community thing, as you're alluding to.
Yeah, I mean, the build hooks, you don't have to embed it in a framework. You just have to provide a dynamic library, and then Flutter Tools embeds it in a framework.
Yeah, if there was a way to just like tell Flutter where to fetch said library, then that would probably be ideal.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the build hooks can do. So that's, yeah.
All right, Darko, you have another question you were keen to learn about from folks?
I see a hand, so let's do that.
I have an idea about improving the developing experience for calling Dart code to a native platform. I have seen a better developing experience for the Dart macros when we used to generate JSON glue codes to deal with JSON. Now we have Dart macros and with only one code to generate built-in glue codes from the Dart.
Mm-hmm.
So the same ideas, if we can generate all the FFI glue codes, especially we had done for the FFI gene, which was built in for the Dart. So maybe we can call the native frameworks or libraries directly from the Dart, not from the FFI gene with lots of generic codes.
Yeah, it's one thing that we are considering, like how far can we like push the automation. So like the grand vision would be no code generator, but you would write import blah 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 .java or import
Yeah.
blah 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 .objective-C, or I guess it's .m if it's Objective-C. That's a grand vision that I'm not entirely sure is feasible, and there are like some reasons for that. For example, there are language mismatches. So in Java you have method overriding. In Dart we don't. So you need to somehow decide, if I translate a Java class to a Dart class and I have like 5 methods called foo, what am I gonna do with? Am I gonna call them foo 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? And then if they're called if they're foo 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and now I get a newer version of my Java package that adds a 6th one, how do I make sure that the new one is foo 6 and not all the previous ones are renumbered, because now all my calls fail, right? So there's like some of these things I don't think we can 100% fully automate. And so that's where like a code generation tool like JNIGen or FFIGen has like a certain amount of configuration that is not fully automatic, simply to bridge these like gaps where it. But if we can get stuff automatic, that's great. But I'm not sure we can. Like another thing that's like really prevalent in the Java world is like every class has methods with types that are other classes. And the question is like, how far do you want that transitivity to go? And like, if you say like, I'm not gonna go transitive, that sucks, because then you have like just, you have a class and all your types are object as the arguments. But if you go transitive all the way, well, now you have just generated, I don't know, a gazillion classes, and everything becomes super slow. So there's like another like place where like 100% automation currently just doesn't work, because you end up at this weird place. So yeah, grand vision, fully automatic, magic, import.java, but reality maybe not feasible. But we want to try to get as close as possible. So for example, for JNIGen, everything that's in like the configuration file, or FFIGen, everything that's in the configuration file that can have a reasonable default, it should not be in the configuration file. So that, yeah.
Thanks. I know there was a lot of debate about that one among the team.
I don't think the debate is settled yet.
Yeah. So I'm glad it's not just us thinking about it. Any other questions, comments, insights? All right, Dako, anything you want to lob into the circle?
Yeah, I want to know, have people tried this stuff, and what cool things have you built with it, or what have you run into that really ticked you off?
I haven't tried FFI yet. Like the last job, that was in a year ago, or dealt with iOS. Last job that I was in like a year ago before I was laid off, dealt with iOS and Android problems. With relations to Flutter, and just trying to get those native parts working. So, we initially got around to by using a plugin that handled both iOS and Android, but we never had the chance to explore FFI as a way to bridge that without having to use a plugin. So I think that's pretty much, it's like lack of adoption, I guess. Like in other words, how would FFI be, in more ways than one, superior to, let's say...
Did you use method channels then to bridge?
Yes, that's what I used the plugin for, it was straight method channels. Yeah. So, how would that supersede, let's say, a plugin that merely wrapped method channels around native calls for each platform?
Synchronous calls?
Well, yeah, I mean, some of them were async on their own, like...
Okay, yeah.
There's, yeah, like for the most...
So one thing is synchronous calls. So
Yeah.
it allows you to do some things that you cannot do otherwise, and that has like a trickle down effect. So if you have like something that needs to like happen atomically, and that you need to do it with 2 method calls, right? With FFI gen or JNI gen, you can do it just with 2 method calls with the generated code because it's synchronous straight line code in Dart, which means nothing happens in between. If you do it with method channels, you kind of need to package it into like one message. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, I think, a lot less code needs to be written because you use the code generator, and especially if you use like Java or Objective-C, those 2 languages are already object-oriented, so you can pretty much interact with those languages immediately from Dart. And then, of course, you still want to write like a platform-agnostic layer above it.
Yeah, like the
right?
like the method layer, like
Yeah.
the platform layer.
But you're not writing any code for like reasoning about serialization or asynchronicity. So like you still need to write the platform layer, but you immediately just call the underlying
So I could
methods.
just pass in arguments straight in, and
Yes.
then call the JNI, the JNI calls. And what about for cases where the code, the actual native code itself is async, but async in the sense that it gives you, that it like exposes a callback. Like I've had that in the past where I had to like use coroutines to wait on async native calls on Android, for example, in order for it to send back the results of Flutter and so forth. So
Yeah, that just works. So you can just pass in callbacks. Yeah.
I see.
The modulo threading,
I see.
which is a whole rabbit hole.
So I'm someone with a background that's like the opposite end of the spectrum from C and C++. So history with Java, where it's you're not compiling down to the metal, and then over to Dart, which is we can compile down to the metal, I guess, but we're not dealing with make files and stuff like that. And before that, it was action scripts, so super divorced from that stuff. But there are places where I would like to make use of FFI, where what I'm running into, which of course this is no fault of Dart or Flutter or anything else, is my own lack of knowledge about how those larger C projects build. So for example, I'd love to put a Flutter UI on Pure Data. Pure Data being a real-time audio synthesis system. Frankly, I don't know where to start with that process. Because on the one hand, we have like hello world examples of, okay, you have a function or 2, here's how you translate. Well, what about when you have something the size of Pure Data? Another example would be FFmpeg. I'd like to interop with that. Now that's not just C, that's C++ is my understanding, so whatever that adds to the puzzle. And so I guess what I'm getting at, to the extent that you could do this, some additional guidance about how to maybe begin to break down a very large project of C and C++ files and start ingesting them into that FFI gen or whatever the tool might be that we want to use. I think that would allow people like me to go a lot further with Dart. Then we publish that to the community, and maybe we see a lot more adoption of FFI as people who don't have because again, people with a massive C background, they'll just go do the C stuff in a lot of cases. So there's this weird situation where the very people who want to make use of this stuff don't have the background to do it. And so if you could help with that, I think we'd see some ecosystem changes. And I'll let you comment on that in a second, but the only other thing on my mind, which I know Simon and I have looked into, and this has been discussed in an issue thread, but just to point it out here, I'd love to play around with real-time audio synthesis directly through Dart. There were 2 problems here, one of which was solved. The original problem was that we couldn't get a call back on the same thread that we called out on when going to C. I believe that's been resolved, but the remaining issue is that with Dart being garbage collected, there's this problem where you can't guarantee the timing, and with the low latency of audio synthesis, that just kind of breaks the use case. So if there were a way to get low latency callbacks on the same thread, we could do audio synthesis, I think, in Dart. But without that, I think we're kind of hosed on that use case.
Let me remember your first question.
That was guidance for those of us with not a lot of
yes.
C experience when translating large
I had
projects.
a funny experience the last half year where Craig from the DevRel team was wrapping an AI library in Dart. And Craig doesn't have a C and C++ background. So this is exactly what you were talking about. Like 75% of the time I was explaining to him how C and C++ works. And that a pointer to a pointer is something else than a pointer to something. And when you have like a pointer to a pointer, it's different than like some inline array. So that I don't know what the right answer is there. Maybe Craig can make some nice videos.
I have a follow-up. I mean, this is part of it, but like to kind of more illustrate exactly the problem. Like let's say you find a library, like there's tiny sound lib, like in C, or like a SQLite extension. It's like a pure C, no dependencies, sometimes header-only file. It's like, I would love to see like example, because I think you were the one that worked on the SQLite FFI example, but it's like, that was like guidance along that vein of like, I have a C library that I want to use, but like, how do I take advantage of it without having to learn the make system and the C make system and all the other stuff too? Because that, and I know it's needed, but it's like, for like no dependency kind of stuff, they're like the happy path might get a little bit easier.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's possible. That's like a discussion that's also very heated in the Interop team, and the PM dream is always like, oh, someone who doesn't know native code can use all the native APIs. I'm not sure if that's possible because, for example, think about like releasing memory, releasing resources, right? Like you talk about SQLite. SQLite, I remember it was the very first thing that I wrote with the FFI SQLite. If you do like a query in a database, you get a result set, and you iterate to the result set, and then you're at the end, you're done. But the thing is, if you don't iterate all the way to the end, you need to actually release the result of your query, otherwise you lose track of the memory and you have a memory leak. And like, if you have never worked in a manual memory management language, this is just a foreign concept to you, right? So how am I going to explain that to you from a Dart land? I think there is, if you want to interoperate with native code, you need to have some basic level understanding of the concept in that space. And I don't know if there's like any cheat code around that. I think just do some tutorials, and I think there's like some question to me is like, okay, there's like general native code tutorials that don't have to be built by Google and the Dart and Flutter team, but there's maybe some like interesting like cross point where it's like, okay, well, you're learning both Dart FFI and C at the same time.
But also you have to learn like, how do I sign this library for 6 platforms, right? Because like, even if it is a only C dependency, like my problem is when I find documentation on GitHub, I can learn how to get it working for desktop, but then it's like, okay, now to sign it for iOS and Android now requires like a different architecture. So like a lot of times people building these libraries don't include like the ARM architecture or whatever for the same. So now I have to then go modify the CMake, and it's like, that was more of saying it's not so much like the native side, because like I can figure out the memory thing, but it was like just literally the build process for like getting it on all the platforms. And
yeah, so I'm hoping that the build hooks, where you only provide the dynamic library and you don't have to sign it because Flutter tools will sign it, I think that will help a little bit. But if you run into an existing library and it just doesn't have set up a build for ARM64, you don't even know if there's like some x64 machine code embedded in that C code.
Right.
And so even if you change the build to accept ARM64, maybe it will just have missing code because someone didn't implement it. And that's just, welcome to native world. It's a hard life. It's like
So, well, let's adjust the ask a little bit, because somehow I think the ask got turned into magic, and that's certainly not what I'm getting at. I'm talking more about a journey of learning. Right now, we're kind of in the draw the owl situation. Draw circle 1, circle 2, then draw the whole damn owl. And so I'm saying that maybe we can put a lot more breadcrumbs out there.
Yeah.
And again, it's like I threw out pure data. There's probably 10,000 projects that are roughly that size and scope. Pick any one of them, put out a GitHub example with the steps that you would take for that one project. We could probably glean a lot from just that one example and then apply that to our particular use case. But again, just based on what I've seen, and maybe I'm out of date on this, but what I've seen is like, here's the most basic thing. Now go figure it out in the real world. And so for me, because I don't have that C background, that's just too much of a chasm for me to jump across.
Yeah, we can definitely try to work with DevRel to see if we can get like a tutorial out. Yeah.
Observable Flutter.
Observable Flutter. I guess I will appear on the next episode.
Yeah, and just as a reminder, if you have any input, the second point was about possible low latency callbacks, which, for example, could be used for audio synthesis.
Yes. Well, we're discussing shared memory multithreading. That would solve a lot of issues. Can't promise anything.
Out of curiosity, like for desktop, how does FFI work with, let's say, hardware drivers of the OS? Like, let's say if you wanted to create an app that allows you to configure some sort of device that uses a driver on, like, let's say Windows or Mac, like, would would it just be dependent on, how would it interface with, like, let's say Windows, for example, which has like a different, like, API, assuming you had the drivers and all, like, would you just have to be abstract about how each platform, implements the way you communicate, or?
You find to like iOS and directly, and then
Right. So it would. I guess the question is, like, would FFI Gen be smart enough to generate that for each platform, provided you assume you have the drivers.
Yeah, you would generate your Dart bindings for every native platform, and then of course you need to build like manually a layer on top.
Yeah, you do
that's
the
agnostic.
target platform.
Yeah.
Switch statement. It was just like a little curiosity thing. Just wanted to.
That is actually a really interesting use of LLMs, right? To be able to say, here's my set of Dart bindings, provide me a layer of abstraction in using, Dart in a way that is familiar to Dart devs, right? To deal with the memory, and that would be a pretty interesting project to be able to build.
Testing, yeah. I actually have a question. We've got several projects, and they use various parts of FFI Gen, FFI, all of the above, and we found several memory issues, that we forgot to release the memory, and there's several great helpers in like whichever set of libraries it is, FFI, Dart FFI / pub package FFI, whatever it is, but you've got like .using, and there's a couple of other wrapper methods. I did not find very much documentation on that. So I was just thinking about you talking about this kind of notion of not understanding the native stuff. I can understand that. We can go find it, and we've fixed a few solutions around this. But it's interesting that for the people that are coming from not a C++ background like myself, they don't understand memory management. Like, they expect garbage collection, and they start using FFI, and it's just completely just blows up on them, right? So I think that there could definitely be better documentation around how memory management works, and how you can use the utilities that are actually already built in to work with those libraries. Just a thought.
I'm writing a complete guide for how to use Dart FFI.
Excellent.
Because I have encountering lots of issues for using the Dart FFI, but I also have native experience. But I have seen a lot of developers was encountering how to use FFI more advanced, like async callback, or even to handle a Dart object in the native libraries, like to use the Dart VMDL API. That was I will document it. I just found everything in the test suite from the Dart SDK repo, but I think lots of new features published by Dart FFI, but the documentation was nothing. Yeah, that is maybe a problem for those developers who first try to use Dart FFI. Maybe we can provide more tutors or guides. That is what I'm doing for. I had published some documents. My recent articles was how to use the memory management in Dart FFI, including a specific malloc library in Windows. Dart FFI version 2 uses cool malloc and cool free instead of malloc and free API. That is critical. A problem if someone didn't know that special and it will cause a crash in Windows with no reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the challenges maybe from our side is that we have contact with the people who contact us, and then they tell their use case, and we try to generalize it and introduce a feature to solve it. But if I think about like all of y'all use cases, that's like a huge funnel that we don't really know about, right? And so we try to build like low-level building blocks that you can combine in a certain way to achieve a certain goal. And I think that speaking about memory management, we have this thing called using, which is like, a syntactic scope, and then you release it at the end. But sometimes that doesn't apply, and it's better to use native finalizers. And conceptually, I know that there's these solutions, and I know that in the Rust ecosystem where you have actual ownership tracking, you can even have way more complicated patterns. But I have never written a big piece of code with Dart and Flutter and native code where I need to actually use these building blocks in like an industry scale. So I think it would be very interesting for us, if there are people who are doing this at industry scale, to write like tech blog posts about this. Like, hey, we were doing this thing with FFI and we needed to solve native memory management, and these are like the patterns we tried and it didn't work because of this, and then we ended up with this pattern. Because like, we are building the building blocks, but we're not actually using them at grand scale. You're the ones who are using them at grand scale. So we can't give you guidance on how to use them at grand scale. Yeah, we can give you guidance on the toy example, but not on the grand scale, and then you need to communicate back to us if it doesn't work on the grand scale, and we need to provide different building blocks.
So I think part of the reason why PHP had like an insane success for so long was people could write PHP, and when they needed to, they could write part of the logic in C to be able to like make it really performant and really interop really nicely. I've seen some things happen recently, which like, in their greater community, which I feel like is maybe something to look into, like if, resources being equal, but like, so like Go has had, Go C toolchain for a while, and it has like a really cool way to, comment C code right above it, where you import whatever, and it's like, Go is a garbage collected language. We could, in Flutterland, have things like lents, that make you know that you have to free this object if you're not calling it. There's some tooling around static analysis I feel like would already be helpful. But something that launched this week was Bun.js, for example, has native support for adding C in JavaScript now. Like, and it's like that as a developer who's using JavaScript, they literally just reference their C code, they define the interface that they want to call that is matching the, if it's adding a counter, they just say it's a number, calling whatever. And for like 90% of the use cases, that's probably what people are wanting, but having the low level building blocks is going to be important for people to get the most performance out and do custom experiences. But I'm curious if that's being explored or thought about, of just like, okay, how do I just like have this more tightly integrated? Because obviously, Go has a problem where as soon as you start introducing C into the build, then, it's a leaky abstraction. But at the same time, that's like why like Go SQLite is so insanely powerful, because you can bind against anything in the library, and it just has a really cool experience. So just wanted to kind of offer that.
All right, great. We're actually at time, but I wanted to do a quick recap. Guidance documentation, big theme. On more complex, at some point, at the right point, I think it's a very fair thing that there needs to be better guidance or resourcing around how to do this at scale for more complex real-world projects. Two, the other thing I took away was, I took us to put this on our DevRel team's radar as something at some point that we would do. And then in terms of abstraction layer, and there's still, this does not solve for needing to do a Dart-specific abstraction layer. Chris, you made perhaps AI could be a help there. as one potential path, but just to be clear, that's not something that solves. Rody, you made a point about how can we think about it tooling-wise, right? What are things we could do on the tooling side of things to help with this? Example is memory management. There's also this, I think there's kind of, where's the line and how much native specific nuances will still be required even with these tools, and I think finding the optimal mix, sounds like at one degree it's not nothing, but it shouldn't be everything. So figuring that out. And I think an important one I wanted to dive into is if we really think about what's the impact of something like Xcode, new Xcode version. Are there any things we're not thinking about in terms of ripple effect if we have these tools that we need to think of and incorporate in our thinking now? Those are key things that jumped out to me.
Wouldn't you have to think about the same thing in Windows for Visual Studio? I mean, wouldn't you have to think about the same for Visual Studio, like with the Xcode problem, where let's say if it's building for like an older version of Windows or something like that, if Microsoft makes a dramatic change in the Windows APIs that renders the existing code incompatible with this new version.
Microsoft would never do that.
I know they never would, but you can't rule it out because Apple does it a lot, as demonstrated by by what he brought up. But yes, I guess it should be on a I don't know. I think it should be unified for something where it kind of like has like some sort of API limit, or I mean, in the Android world we have like build versions, but I don't, obviously because it's so open-ended with Flutter, so maybe there has to be a way to define what constitutes a version in the context of a platform, like let's say for Mac OS, version 10.15 or something.
Yeah, we have an open design issue for a thing that I call external versions.
Yeah,
and it will basically be like a map from string, like this is my external version thing, like NDK or iOS system API, and then like on the value side of the map, it depends. Like if you're at runtime, you have a specific version, but if you're like at code generation time, maybe you have like a range of the lowest version and the highest version you want to support.
And even then, like because it's a string, you have to do version parsing, unless you have like a number that defines that particular version. So, I mean, with Android, you don't have that because we have API levels, and we're able to easily filter out like code that only works in one but not the other.
Yeah. I had a discussion with one of the teammates about like, can we assume that version strings are semantic versioning? Yes or no? Question mark.
All right, thank you. I wanted to make sure we wrap up and give folks a break, because I imagine there'll be at least some of the same faces for the next session, and hopefully more. But Dako, thank you so much, and thanks to everybody. Any parting words or call to action?
Thanks for your input, and we would love your contributions and engagement on GitHub. So file issues, plus upvote, and fix issues. That's even better.
Thank you.